July Café Scientifique. Just going to run through a couple of events that we've got coming up for the next couple of months so that you remember, particularly since the quarterly newsletter hasn't gone out. So next month, our cafe speaker is Chantal Knowles, who is the head of human history at Auckland Museum, and the title the last time we told you about it, we had just put in a stopgap title while we waited for a better one to come, and it is now arrived. It is The Matter in Museums, Stories from the Stores. And so Chantal will be reflecting on experiences of 5 different museum systems in 4 different countries on 3 different continents. In September, we have Royal Society Fellow Professor Cathy Campbell, who's going to be talking about extremophiles, astrobiology, and life out of this world. And then in October, hopefully the bar manager will come back and turn the music down, that'd be great. And then October, our last cafe of the year, will be Pete Brooks from Auckland Council coming to talk about some of the applications of environmental engineering that he's involved in and some of the really cool projects that he does. Can we turn the music off? Thank you so much. So of course tonight we've got fresh from NIWA, we have Dr. Annette Semadeni-Davies.
Yeah, good attempt.
It was the Davis I thought I was going to screw up.
You did.
Yeah. Is it Davies?
Yes.
Davies,
yes.
Okay, there we go. You'd think I'd get this right. So yes, fresh from NIWA earlier today, Annette is going to be talking to us about catchment modelling for water quality and what it can and can't tell us, and of course she's also promised to tell us why modelling is important. And we've got some, in lieu of slides, we've got some handouts on the table. So without further ado, can we all please introduce, welcome Annette.
Thank you. Now, I'm a typical scientist, I think, in doing PowerPoint presentations. So this is my first ever presentation where I haven't had PowerPoints. So it's going to be a bit of a hard ride for me. My name is Annette Semadeni-Davies. It's a tough one to say, sorry Scott, but it's quite tough. I am a member of the Urban Aquatics team at NIWA, where I've been since 2006. My background is in physical geography, where I did my master's and my bachelor's at Auckland University, and then I headed off overseas and I did my PhD in water engineering in Lund, Sweden. So I came back in 2006, started at NIWA, and I want to talk to you today about what I've been doing to pay my mortgage for the last 16 or so years, and that's water quality modelling. So, here are my PowerPoints, so excuse me if I keep folding them over, but I'll try my best to try and paint you a picture of what I'm talking about. So the questions I want to answer today is, what on earth is a water quality model? 2 is, why do we need them? Why are they important? 3 is, what model should we use? Because there are literally dozens of models out there. And then finally, I want to talk about what the challenges are, because as you might have heard, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. So models are, because they are models, they are full of uncertainties. So that means there are places where they're appropriate to use and places where they're not appropriate to use. So I'll finish off with a little bit of that. There's such a small number of people here that we can keep this quite informal, so I don't mind if you stick your hand up or something, if you don't mind, so if you have a question, just ask me straight off. Okay, so what is a model? Well, a model is a set of algorithms or equations that describe what is happening in the real world. Okay, so it will take input data. I'm talking deterministic models here, you might have heard that term before. It takes input data, it has algorithms that describe a process, and then it gives us an effect. So the simplest models out there you might remember from school are say, linear regression models where you might have F as a function of Y. So the models that I use are a lot more complicated than that. So input data, for example, in a water quality model, land use or land cover. Okay, the difference between land use and land cover is land use is the enterprise. It might be dairy farming or it might be commercial land use in cities versus residential land use. Land cover is things like if you're in an urban area, I'm not really interested in if it's commercial or an industrial area. I'm interested in what's on top of the roof. Okay, because the roof, if it's galvanised steel and it's not painted, that's a source of zinc. Okay, so climate, drainage, slope, those sorts of things are the input data that we use. And then the processes we have are our surface hydrology, build up and wash off of contaminants. So during dry periods, your contaminants build up, rain comes along, washes them off. Okay, and then the effect is the water quality. So if you're talking about rural areas, you'll be mostly interested in nutrients or chlorophyll. If you're in an urban area, we're also interested in metals. Either urban or rural, we're interested in bugs because they make people sick, and we're interested in sediments because they have an effect on the ecological health of streams. So that's broadly speaking what a model is. So why do we need water quality models? Well, most of the work that I do is for central government or for regional government, but I've also done work for developers. Okay, so central government, it's things like policy development. Regional government, it's implementation of that policy and how you do that. It's things like catchment planning, okay? So how do we manage this catchment? How do we put in mitigation? So if you've got lots of dairy cattle, for example, what can we do to stop what comes out of the back end of the cow getting into the river? Okay, so what's the best thing to put where? Environmental impact assessment. So I want to build a new subdivision. What effect is that going to have on the stream next to the subdivision? Then property and farm management. So you're Farmer Brown and you're told that you have to clean up your act. How are you going to clean up your act? Okay, so it's lots of different purposes out there that we would use them for. Next thing I want to say is water in New Zealand is a really political hot potato. I heard somebody talking today about three waters. I don't have an opinion on that. I'm going to share because I'll get in trouble either way. I don't work with that sort of thing anyway. But the slide that I was going to show you was put together in 2017. And if you remember back at that election, water quality was a massive point in that election. It was hardly a day would go by before there would be a big headline thing about water management and about farms and about farmers saying, but it's their fault, those urbanites over there, it's their fault. And then the townies saying, nah, it's you guys and your cows. In actual fact, it's everybody's fault, but what are we going to do about it? So it's a political hot potato. Then what do we do with water management in New Zealand? We have a document that governs that in New Zealand that's called the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and that's been a huge part of my life since 2014 because that governs what water quality should be in New Zealand. So you might remember a few years ago there was swimmability. Remember people talking about swimmability? To me, swimmability is you cannot have a 95th percentile E. coli concentration that is greater than 260 colony-forming units per, I think it's metre squared. But anyway, that's what I think of when I think that. And that comes out of what's known as the National Objective Framework, which is part of the National Policy Statement. Okay, so what does that actually say? Well, it's a huge circle. I don't know if you can all see a handout there, but the cartoon that I've got there shows the government thinking about that. And first of all, let's talk. Okay, regional councils have to talk to people in there. How they choose to do that is up to the council. That means local iwi, it means local landowners, it means developers, it means enterprise owners, it means people who are interested in water like you. Okay, so you consult and you say, what is the value of this water? There are nationally compulsory values like ecosystem health, but you might also have mahinga kai, so food gathering, you might have recreational values, you might have amenity values, and each of those values is got different objectives with it. Okay, you would have a narrative objective. So, for example, if you're talking about amenity, you might say the water has to look nice and clear. I don't want muddy water. Okay, then you have a water quality criteria that goes with that. So that's your water quality objective. And that would be, okay, to have nice clear water, you can't have more sediment in that river more than X. Okay, so you've got your value, then you've got your objectives, and then you've got your attribute. And the attribute that I just told you about was sediment. Okay, so that attribute will have a criteria with it. Okay, you can't have that attribute higher than particular concentration, and that's where you need models, because we don't measure water quality at every point in every river. Okay, so part of the process is, first of all, you find out what the current state is. Now, we have current state at points around the country. There's something like 270 that are monitored regularly by regional councils. You can find out about those at LAWA. Yeah, LAWA, if you just look that up on the interwebs, you'll find a site that tells you where those sites are and what the water quality is there. And then once you know the current state, you can say, well, what do I need to do to get the water quality that is required to meet those values? So there is where you have models coming in. First of all, models for telling you your current state. Then you have models that allow you to think, what do I need to do? Well, if I put in riparian planting, maybe the problem will go away. Maybe it won't. So that's where I come in. That's my part in this whole process. So what types of model are there out there? I've already mentioned one of them, which is the linear regression. That's a so-called black box model. It's called black box because you can't see what's inside. It doesn't explain anything. It's just a cause and an effect with an empirical relationship between them. Then there are white box models, which have the entire set of governing equations. So in water, it would be Navier-Stokes, for example, that says which direction all the molecules and everything moves in the water. That's far too complicated. So you have grey box models, which have elements of both. Okay, so I work mainly with those. Then you have your spatial distribution. You can have fully distributed, where you look at every point on the land. Well, you can't look at every point, but you might look at every 100-metre block or something. Or you have spatially lumped, and that's more or less what I use, as spatially lumped models, where you might have a subcatchment. There is a thing out there called the River Environments Classification that NIWA put out, and it maps an approximation of the drainage network in New Zealand, where it's broken up into stream reaches and subcatchments. So when I'm talking spatially lumped, I am semi-distributed in that I know what is roughly going on in each of those subcatchments, but within those subcatchments, the information I have is smoothed over spatially. Okay, and then we can have time. Okay, there are dynamic models. Dynamic models are time series models. So they say every 15 minutes something happens, a calculation is made. Or if you're talking about an urban model. If you're talking about a rural model, it's more likely to be every day. Every day something happens and we make up a time series of what's happening. What I use mainly is steady state models, and that's saying over the length of time, all things being equal, things smooth out and we have this mean average. Okay? So the model that I use is that sort of model. So I work with a very simple sort of a model, mainly. So which model do you use? There are literally dozens of models out there. Okay, and which one you use depends on the purpose and what you're doing the model for, the extent you're doing it. Are you doing it nationally? Are you doing it regionally? Are you doing it for a city block? Okay, and it depends on what data you have available. There's no point doing a 15-minute model if you only have climate that's daily, unless you've got some magic way, and there are people who do have magic ways of breaking a daily time step into 15 minutes. So the picture I've got here is the 3 areas where I've been working in. National models, and I'll give you an example of that going forward. National models are usually done by, central government. For the last 3-4 years I've been doing modelling for MFE and for MPI, and that's mainly for policy development. So I mentioned the swimmability. There's also a policy surrounding stock exclusion. Right, a big role in that. And then that was to test the impacts of the policy and also to provide information to economists who wanted to know how much would you get, what's the bang for your buck if all the farmers put in some mitigation and it has X reduction in nutrients, how much will that cost? Okay, and there I've been using the clues model, which I'll come on to in a moment. Okay, if you're talking about catchments, it's either the regional councils or the local territorial authorities. And they'll be doing it for things like freshwater regional plans. They'll be doing it for trying to implement the policy. How can we implement the policy that's coming out for the government? What do we need to do? And there I could use SWOT, the clues model, or I could use a dynamic model like SWOT. Actually, I wouldn't do it, one of my colleagues would do it, but I help provide her with information and stuff. And the SWOT model runs at a daily time step and is one of these dynamic models and works at a finer resolution than what I work with. Okay. Then you have a farm model. So Farmer Brown needs to make a farm management plan. Okay, so they need a different sort of a model, and they would, up until very recently, be using the overseer model, but that model's been a very controversial one lately for reasons I'm not going to get into here, but if you're interested, you can look up overseer and find out what's been going there. So what is the clues model? Okay, the clues model is the catchment land use for environmental sustainability model, and it must have taken my colleague Sandy, who put this model together many years ago now, it must have taken him days to figure out that acronym. It's such a nice one, clues.
Say that again?
Clues. Catchment land use for environmental sustainability. That's the first thing you do when you start a new model, is you sit down and think, what are we going to call it? We had a model that we were working on for urban, and in the end we called it UPSW because everything we came out with, like stormwater, came out like spew. Stormwater planning for environmental waters or stuff like that. Spew. And we decided, no, we're just going to go like UPSWA, urban planning for urban planning for stormwater. It's not near as good as spew. There you go. And that is a modelling system it's a large-scale model, so it's run nationally or at the catchment or regional level. Okay, and it is a quick and easy model to run. It's free for anyone who wants to download it and use it, providing they've got access to a GIS system. It's a steady state model that gives annual values. It's semi-distributed, so it goes down to the sub. And it is what is known as a screening model. Okay, It's good for telling you where the hot spots are that you need to pay closer attention to. That's what it's intended for. Don't go and run it for a farm and tell me my model doesn't work. Because I'll tell you, of course it doesn't. You've run it in the wrong place. And it's used for policy development and catchment planning mainly. So, you all on board with that? Okay, so the water quality outputs that you would get from clues are mean annual loads and yields. Okay, anybody know what a yield is? No?
No, what is it?
A yield is a mass coming off the land per unit area. So if I say dairy cows have a annual yield of 14 kilograms per hectare, that's the yield. Okay, the load.
But that would depend on how many cows you had on that page.
Yeah, that's part of the model. The number of cows is part of the model. Okay. Yes, it would. But not as much as you would think, actually.
When you say, 14 kilograms per hectare or whatever, do you mean 14 kilograms of cow per hectare?
No, 14 kilograms of nitrogen.
Oh, 40 kilograms, oh, right.
Okay, nitrogen is poo.
And pee.
Yeah, no, nitrogen is wee. Phosphorus is poo. Okay. Nitrogen is usually dissolved. Phosphorus is usually bound to particles, bound to sediments. So, yeah. Sediments and E. coli. Okay, E. coli are particularly notorious because if you're anything within 20% of the real number, you count yourself lucky with E. coli. Okay, so yields are what's actually coming off the land. The load is the mass. So if you have no losses, say in soil or groundwater or anything like that, you would get the yield and multiply it by the area and you get a load. It's not as simple as that because some of it gets lost on the way. Okay, and then you've got to somehow turn that into concentration. Okay, because all the criteria are in concentrations, but all the models are in loads. So turning a load into a concentration is not an easy thing when you've got an annual model. And usually what I do is say, all else being equal, a percentage change in load equals the same percentage change in concentration, which is absolute BS, but it's the best I can do. Okay. Or you can come out with some statistical relationship between mean and median concentrations, but I'm not going to get into that. Okay, so what are challenges to modelling? I've just mentioned one of them is trying to turn loads into concentrations. Okay, here's the data requirements. For example, the model I mentioned before, SWAP model, it's an American model and it uses soil parameters that we don't measure in New Zealand. So we have to try and figure out what those parameters would be by converting what we do have in New Zealand to that. And that's where we get our friends from Landcare Research, or what do they call themselves now? Manaki Whenua. Okay, and we get them to tell us, and they have a thing called SMAP. Okay, SMAP is their latest version of their soil data, and it replaces another one that's called the Fundamental Soil Layer. Unfortunately, SMAP isn't available everywhere, so we often have to go back to the fundamental soil layer. So it's what data do we actually have? Okay, land use. Okay, the data that we have that comes again from Landcare, it might tell us there's pasture, but what sort of pasture is it? Is it dairy? Is it sheep? Is it beef? Is it deer? Now, there is a data set there, but it's a commercial data set, and if I want to use it, I've got to pay a lot of money to use it. Okay, as an actual fact, I have paid a lot of money to use it, but I have to sign an agreement, so I can't pass some of that stuff on. So then there's gaps in our knowledge of processes. Okay, how do things work? What's actually happening? And how do we take something so complex and make it into a model that we can do on a PC without having to resort to a supercomputer? Okay, there are lots of these different challenges here, but I'm going to limit myself to 2 challenges with 1 example. Okay, and that's looking at modelling riparian management using the CLUES model. Okay, one of my colleagues in Melbourne, she talks about this by citing Donald Rumsfeld. Remember him?
Yes.
Remember what he says? There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown knowns. It's exactly the same with catchment modelling. The models that we have model the known knowns. But in reality, there's a whole lot of known unknowns. We know they're unknown. You know, we know they're there. That's part of the uncertainty of the model. And then there are a whole lot of unknown knowns that we haven't even thought about. So, it's a problem. So,
That applies to just about everything.
yeah, it does. But when I've got councils and government breathing down my throat to say, hey, we need red, green or yellow, and I say, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And they say, but government, like doing work for a council at the moment, and I'm telling them that my model or any model would have difficulty modelling E. coli through wetlands. And the latest data that's come out, the latest wetland guidance that's come out, doesn't even include E. coli because it's so unknown that they can't generalise. Sometimes wetlands will decrease E. coli, but sometimes if you've got duck or geese, they can increase E. coli. Okay? Sometimes you get lots of die-off. Other times the water's nice and warm and E. coli love that, so they actually increase. So there's so little knowledge that we have there. We can't, with any certainty, put them in our model. And the council says to me, but Annette, you need to put that in there because the government's telling us we have to plan for it and we have to meet the national objective framework. And I say, okay, I'll put it in, but I'm putting in a giant caveat. Okay, so that's what I have to do.
I mean, one of the things would be that, for instance, with pasture, apart from the animals get on it, would be the type of grass.
Yep. Type of grass, it's that's a little bit more sophisticated.
Massive in different
Yeah.
changes.
I'm not arguing with you. I'm agreeing with you totally. Things like riparian planting. Okay, what are the known benefits of riparian planting? Well, there's shade. Where you've got shade, you've got cooler water. Where you've got cooler water, you've got more dissolved oxygen. Where you've got more dissolved oxygen, you've got healthier fishies. Okay, so it's important for ecosystem health. Also, fish like cooler water, not hot water. Okay, bank strengthening. If you chop down the trees that are on the bank, your bank's going to slump. Okay, there's stock exclusion itself. If you've got a nice wide 5 metre riparian margin, those cows are going to find a very difficult job getting into their water. Cows love to stand in water. And when they relax, they wee and they poo, and it goes directly into the water. Okay, get those cows out of the river.
Is it how far back they have to be? 5 metres from
It depends. The draft is for fencing with a 1 metre setback, but what they would like to do is to have riparian planting in some places with a 5 metre setback. Yeah. But we have very little information on catchment-wide effects. Remember, I work on a catchment basis, so how much effect does riparian planting for stock exclusion affect nutrient loads when most of the cows are nowhere near the river? They're upstream somewhere. How do I translate what's happening in a paddock? Because most of the research is done at the paddock level. How do I translate what's happening in a paddock to a catchment? It's locational. We don't know where they are. Okay, we don't know where the fencing is. We get told by industry they've got 80% compliance, but we don't know where the fencing is. Okay, and I'll discuss that in a moment. I suggested maybe we should fly some drones along, but then it's privacy. You have to ask the landowner if you could fly a drone across, and drones make mighty fine target practice.
So
Okay.
how do you collect the data that goes into the model? How much time do you normally spend? Like, do you have to be there for the 4 seasons of a year, or a week, or how
Depends
long?
on the type of model. It really depends on the type of model, but most of the data that I've got is annual data, and I don't collect the data myself. I have minions that do it for me, or I use nationally available data.
So it's quite a team, a
Yeah.
big team?
Yeah, but if you're doing, say, a paddock scale model or SWOT or something like that, you might actually be on site collecting the data yourself.
Right.
When I do urban modelling, I'm a little bit more precise.
Do you take, say, catch eels in the streams, or?
Oh, that's what the ecologists do.
Anything else to, and analyse them to see if they've got poisons in them, or?
The ecologists do that, but it's anecdotal stuff for me. I mean, I need quantified numbers. Okay, but the models that I do can tell ecologists where they need to look. Okay. And it's all corroboration as well. Like, if you're talking about an urban area, we have MCI, which is the macro invertebrates index, and there we can relate that to water quality. So our water quality is used to guesstimate the MCI, and then we can go and look and see how many bugs there actually are. Okay. So there's little information on setback width or vegetation types. So we know that riparian planting can remove up to 70% of nitrates, but we don't have enough information to form relationships between what's actually happening to get that 70%. And we don't know about the quality of the implementation and maintenance. Okay, so now you know all about riparian modelling and the problems. There are problems with putting riparian margins into a model. Next step is, how do I actually represent that? Okay, now remember, I've got a quite simple model. Even, how do we actually put a mitigation in? So the latest one I'm working with is bunds, for example. Very little research out there on bunds. A bund is basically a dam that goes across a gully and stops water getting into the stream in the first place, that sort of thing. Or the wetlands. How do I get that information I've got into my model? Well, it's hard. Generally what I do in the model that I'm using is I put in what's known as a load reduction factor, which is just a percentage. Okay, so we know that wetlands will remove, if you've got 2% coverage of a catchment area in wetlands, it will remove from about 60% to 90% of sediment. So I say, right, we've got wetlands here, I'm going to cut down that load that I've done of sediment by 60% for the lower bound and 90% for the upper bound, and in the middle for roughly the average. Okay, now if I were doing a model like SWOT, I would do wetlands a different way. I would use something like a first order decay curve, and that says how long has the water been in that wetland. Okay, over that time we know a certain amount of particles are going to fall out. Okay, and it's going to be a curve relationship. Or you can get totally physical, and I've done this before as well for urban modelling, and you can actually put in Navier-Stokes equations, and you can say, okay, my sediment is in the size range of silt up to sand, and my distribution is mostly silt and a little bit of sand, and then I can say, right, I'm going to say that my particles are all round and my water's moving at this speed and it's this temperature, so I know it's that viscosity. So I'm going to say my particles are going to drop out. Mostly the coarse ones are going to leave all the fine ones, so downstream any remaining is going to be fine. Now I've done that before with the urban models, but it's sort of a little bit over the top for what I do with the national models. Can be done, but you need a supercomputer to do it. So I've done 3 studies so far for MFE and MPI in the last 4 or 5 years on national modelling of E. coli. I've done 1 for swimmability and I've done 2 for draft policies on stock exclusion. First stock exclusion one was in 2016, and the last one was just during the lockdown. So that's what I did during the first lockdown. Okay. The data that we got on the baseline of fencing came from a piece of work that Landcare does every couple of years, and that's the Survey of Rural Decision Makers, where they send out to farmers a survey that they have to fill in, and they offer them Prezi cards and iPads and all those sorts of things to get them to do so, because the last thing a farmer wants to do is fill in a survey that he doesn't have to do. Okay, so there you got the self-sorting. Only the farmers that are interested in doing the survey will do the survey.
Yes.
Okay, and then I got that information and I was given it at super regional level, not regional level, not farm level, not catchment level, super regional level. And that was because Landcare wanted to protect the farmers. They didn't want to say, oh, look, there's only 2 dairy farmers in West Coast. You know, then I can guess which one's filling in the survey. So I was given it super regional, so I had 1 region for the entire South Island. I had Upper North Island, Central North Island, and Lower North Island. So I had Upper and Lower. I think I had just 2 and 3. I had 3 super regions. So instead of having a national value, I had 3 values, 2 for North Island, 1 for South Island. And then I had future state scenarios of where you would do stock exclusion based on slope and stream size. Slope we can get from LiDAR, we can get from elevation maps. That's not so much a problem. It is a problem if you're trying to smooth it over a catchment though. Stream size. I don't have stream size for every river in the country. So your policy says, this is the Dairy Accord, you should put in stock exclusion for any stream that's permanently flowing, that's wider than a stride and deeper than a gumboot. Okay, that's great. Luckily for me, one of my colleagues has done some modelling himself and he's come out with a magic way of finding out the width of streams. I don't know the depth of the streams, but I know the width. So I just had to say, okay, well, if it's in the river environments classification, it's permanently flowing and it will be deep. Okay, so then that width was based on the modelled flow, not real flow, modelled flow. So I'm using output, secondary output of a model as data from my model. Then I got the removal efficiencies from literature, and that was done by a colleague of mine at Ag Research. And we had information for fencing, but we didn't have any information for riparian planting. So Richard says, I reckon it'd be about 10% more efficient if we put plants on there for the stock exclusion. Remember, fencing and riparian planting, when you're talking about cattle, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're stopping the cows getting into the stream. So I reckon, in my opinion, as a ag research person, that it's an extra 10%. So that's what we ran with. So the latest work that we did was in 2020, and we did draft stock exclusion policy, and we had 4 scenarios, and each scenario had 2 variants. One with just national policy, and one with national policy and also regional policy, because some regions go further. Okay, they go deeper down than the national one. They go the extra mile sort of thing. So we had, in effect, 8 different scenarios. And that ranged from doing the bare minimum to going all out, excluding all stock everywhere, which is totally crazy and is not going to happen, but it gives us an extreme to see what the end point would be. And then we use this delta change that I told you about before, where I say a percentage change in load is the same as a percentage change in concentration, which again, as I said, is not correct, but it's the best we can do. It would be correct for some things, but not for others. And then we compared it to the length of streams in each national objective framework class. So we have Class A is top notch, meets all requirements. Class E, you don't want to be in that water. You don't want to be anywhere near that water. You certainly don't want to put your head under. Okay, so we use the current state comes from work that was done by another colleague of mine who used a technique called random forests, which is a type of regression analysis mixed with machine learning. Okay, so she came up with what the current state is. Then I said, okay, well, that's the concentration we're working with. My load changes by that much. I shall get your current state and I shall change it by my percent load change. And then I saw how that would change these length of streams around the country in each of these bands. And I came out with maps and I came out with tables. And that information is publicly available. All my work that I do for national government is available. Just look up my name in E. coli and you'll find it. No secrets here. Okay. So, unfortunately, without PowerPoints, I can't really show you much about the experiments with LIDAR. Have people heard about LIDAR?
Yes.
Yep. It's a means.
Archaeology.
Pardon?
In archaeology, yes.
Yeah. It's a way of getting superfine resolution elevations. Now, there's 2 things you can get with it. You can get what's known as a DEM, digital elevation model, and that's the ground surface. To me, these are magic. Okay, and then again, DSM, digital surface model, and that's what's above the ground as well. So if you subtract the DEM from the DSM, you get the height of things like buildings and trees. Then if you put a buffer around your streamline, you can say, oh, look at all those trees. And if you look at the figure there I've got, you can see it quite plain. You can see where there's trees there. Only problem is the resolution is different. So LIDAR has a 1 metre resolution. My stream network has a 30 metre resolution, which means that my blue lines don't actually meet up with the real streams. Okay? Now, the picture there is actually done with 8 metre resolution. So the stream network from that picture was done with 8 metre resolution. So each elevation cell was 8 metres wide, and that was what we used to make the stream network. What it does is it says, okay, you've got a stream, you've got a grid cell, you've got a square of 8 metres, and it has this elevation. It's got 8, so no, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's got 8 cells around it. Which one of those has a lower elevation? It's going to that one, and so on, so on. That's how you build those blue lines up. Now that means that I can't put a buffer around the blue line and capture the riparian planting, because my blue line is actually 10, 15 metres away from the stream, the actual stream. So, okay, in the next picture I've got there, if you picture it, the first one there is digital elevation model done with a 13-metre resolution, which is what I've used for my streams that I use in the clues model. I didn't do it, it's other people have done it, I shouldn't say that. But in the clues model, it's got a 13-metre resolution drainage network. Okay, now you could halve that and you could make it 15-metre resolution. That quadruples the amount of data that you need. Now if we use LiDAR, 900 cells, 900 data points for every data point that I had in my original. Now we're talking supercomputer. Now we're talking, it cannot be done. We can do it for maybe a small catchment or a farm, but we cannot do it nationally. Last slide. So reiterate again, all models are wrong. Some of them are useful. They are useful, they're very important, but you've got to realise that they have uncertainties in them, and you've got to understand that uncertainty. But you've also got to trust that they are pointing in the right direction. They might not give you the exact number, but they're giving you the trends. They're giving you a thing that you can hang your policy on or your planning on. So it's can be reliable, but you've got to be aware that there are uncertainties involved. And what I wanted to say there is that water quality modelling is required for managing water in New Zealand. It's required for managing water everywhere. What I'm talking about is a worldwide issue. And it's a high stakes political game. So I'm under pressure from national government, I'm under pressure from central and from regional government and local governments to give them the information that they need. And there's a lot of uncertainty. But having said that, there are ways of filling those gaps that we have, but they will cost a lot of money. And if you'll just indulge me for a moment, I'll just read out some of I've got 10 points here that I want to make that would help us along if we had the time and the money to do it. One is we need clear guidance on monitoring protocols. So the people that are actually doing the water quality modelling and monitoring, providing the data that I use, actually are aware of what I need. So the regional councils, they measure state of environment once a month. That's not enough for a model. Okay, when I'm trying to do rating curves and relate concentration to flows, I need more than once a month. What they're monitoring, how they're doing it. I need consistency between the regions. We need targeted long-term field studies that cover the full range of conditions. So at the moment they're monitoring, they won't go out because of health and safety and measure very, very high flows that are likely to have the highest contaminant loadings. Health and safety, but we could do better. We need different methods of doing monitoring so that we can get that data. We need innovation and techniques. We need studies into the efficacy of multiple measures. So what happens if I do, herd housing and denitrification of feeding of cattle, and I do riparian planting, and I do wetlands. What do all those things do in tandem? And we don't know. If I'm using a percentage change, the way to think about it is if I've got a stormwater pond and it removes, say, 75% of the sediments and most of it's coarse, then only the fines are going to be left. So the next thing down the track might not do as well as you think it is because there's no coarse particles left. Okay. Paired catchment studies to determine catchment scale impacts. And that's hard, really hard, finding two catchments that are alike in everything except for the one thing you're looking at. Metadata. Instead of just giving me numbers, I want to know how those numbers were obtained. I want to know where they were maintained. I want to know what sort of plants were there. I want to know the setback width. That sort of thing. Geodatabases to tell us where mitigations actually are. You know? So where are our fences? Where's our riparian planting? Honesty in reporting. This is a big one. Not all modelers are quite as honest as I am. I got told once that I'm so honest that somebody's going to shoot me one day. No, sometimes they're not being dishonest because they're dishonest people, but because they don't actually know. Especially if they're just out of university. And adequate funding to undertake all of the above. And that's where I think I shall leave it.
Well, it sounds to me as though you have the most complicated thing you could possibly have taken up. And I mean, then you have these floods and everything is sort of wiped out and you've got to virtually start again.
Yeah, I don't work much with flooding. That's a whole other ball game. At NIWA we have different groups of modellers. I am a water quality modeller. Christchurch people are hydrological modellers, so they do your floods and your water allocation and that sort of stuff, and your hydro dams. And then we've got the climate modellers, completely different set. We've got the fisheries modellers. We're all modelling, but different systems.
Okay, so thank you very much, Annette. Can I ask everyone to please give her a very warm round of applause? Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We hope that you've enjoyed our video. If you have, please make sure that you like and subscribe, and that way you can catch more of us later. Ka kite anō.